Silicon Valley always used to pride itself in its own narcissistic way that tech shapes the rest of the world and the rest of the world tags along. But increasingly, it seems as if the street now is shaping the street, the real street, not Wall Street, the street in the rest of America in particular is shaping Silicon Valley. More and more of this week's news in venture and tech is being shaped by the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, or at least it seems. Keith, from your newsletter this week, you have your own tagline, Black Founders Matter. What's going on now?
Well, what I'm really doing there, to use a current word, is I'm amplifying somebody else. There's a great investor in Southern California who's Latinx, as she calls herself, Lolita Torb, who this week has, not just this week, I mean, she's been prolific in trying to engage with the problem of the underrepresentation of founders of color, founders with different sexual preferences, and investors as well. And this week, she's just had a flood of tweets, which I've put at the top of the newsletter. One talks about Low Tony at Plexo Capital, who's trying to create a Y Combinator for underrepresented founders, people of color. She also amplifies a Black Founders list, which has got 240 Black founders on it. And she talks about BLCKVC, Black VC, Sydney Sykes. So she's just doing a fantastic job and getting a lot of recognition for it. So this week I'm recognizing her. But there's a lot more. There's a great story about why, if you want to change venture capital, you have to focus on what's known as LPs, that is, say, limited partners. Those are the people who invest in venture funds. People like the Stanford Endowment, the Harvard Endowment, the California State Pension Fund, they choose the investors. So if the LPs are aware of the opportunity to put money into the hands of great potential investors who are not like the normal people, that would be great. You know, my own venture fund in the UK, the 4 founders, I hate to say, were 4 white guys, all getting on a bit. I was one of them. All 4 of us, by the way, were from Yorkshire.
Oh my God.
Pure coincidence, but all 4 of us were from Yorkshire. And much as I appreciated being believed by LPs, I think that's a fairly common story. There's a lot more besides, by the way. There's a story, you decide what you want to pick up on, but there's a great story from the Mercury News. For Black CEOs, Silicon Valley is a humiliation, is part of doing business.
I saw that, and this idea that a Black CEO, if he brings their wing guy with him who happens to be white, they walk into a room and the rest of the crowd always assumes that it's the white guy in charge. What is it? Is it just white people everywhere, or is it particularly in Silicon Valley are just intuitively, intrinsically racist and always assume that the black guy is the number 2?
Well, if racism is truly systemic and structural, it really isn't a shock that human beings, even good human beings who don't want to be racist, act as if they are. And so humiliation is being sidetracked or being ignored, or worse still, being laughed at and talked about behind your back. I don't want to name names, but I have a very good African-American friend here in Palo Alto who sold his first company to a big East Coast public company, came west. He's from the South. He has totally failed to be able to raise capital for his new ideas, and his new ideas are quite good. And you know, you can't really explain it unless you assume there's some racism involved.
Yeah, I remember doing a wonderful future cast in Atlanta a few years ago where the whole room was full of African-American startup entrepreneurs. And one of the things that I picked up was that their ideas are often very different from the white entrepreneurs, much less focused on the privilege of young white guys educated at Stanford and Harvard. So I think obviously there's justice to be done here. But
Yeah.
it's also about funding more interesting ideas, ideas that actually apply to a broader swathe of the population.
Yeah, it's interesting. Jasmine Johnson, who's another African American investor, female, she tweeted a couple of weeks ago, the problem for African American founders is they don't know the language of venture capital because their cultural background hasn't taught them it. And I reached out to her, and yesterday
What does that mean then?
well, it's things like the difference between a lifestyle business and a venture backable business was the one she focused on. The idea that venture capitalists invest in businesses is fake. Venture capitalists invest in businesses that can grow at a certain rate over a certain period of time and reach a certain amount of revenue with a certain amount of gross profit. So the filtering out process, for example, TechCrunch couldn't raise venture capital. It wasn't big enough. It would never have been big enough.
So who are the most prominent African American entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley? Is there a blue chip entrepreneur, somebody who could just walk in anywhere and raise money just with any idea because people trust him or her?
If you leave out the word entrepreneur, then I think there are a lot of black African American anyway candidates for funding in the Silicon Valley ecosystem. Like take David Drummond.
Well, I was thinking of Drummond, but he got pushed out at Google, and I don't know what he's doing now.
Well, that was private issues to do with his personal life, and okay, let's just ignore that for a minute. He did rise to the top of Google. He was in charge of all corporate development, and he was in charge of all their venture capital investments that went through the company, not the ones that went through Google VC. And he was probably one of the most powerful people in Silicon Valley. So could he have gone out and raised money for his own idea? I suspect the answer is yes, he could. I absolutely could have done. He's not an entrepreneur, so he's never going to do it. But think about the white equivalent of that. David Drummond is far and away better than most white people that get invested in. If you took the black person that was equivalent of some of the founders that do get invested in, no, you have to be a David Drummond.
Well, one who comes to mind is Ev Williams, who's started a number of successful businesses. I saw he did something pretty impressive at Medium in terms of addressing this overt racism in Silicon Valley. What's going on with Medium and investment?
Well, Medium just put Colin Kaepernick on their board today, actually, as part of an agreement for Medium to also be the publisher of Colin Kaepernick's new magazine.
Bold move. I think we should applaud that. I think it's very impressive. He didn't have to do that, right?
Yeah, I mean, Colin Kaepernick, let's be honest, Colin Kaepernick was a hero to some of us right at the beginning when he took a knee. But in mainstream society, he was a pariah. And the NFL got away with isolating him. It's unbelievable, but they got away with isolating him. He now looks like a genius.
Yeah, I mean, they made him unemployed. And speaking of unemployment, Keith, in the African-American community, of course, the crisis continues in unemployment. The numbers today are bad again, another 1.5 million people applying for unemployment. How is Silicon Valley addressing the increasing unemployment crisis in America? And are there products coming out of Silicon Valley trying to fix this, figure it out?
Well, you go both sides with that, but on the side of saying yes, DoorDash raised 400 million this week. Instacart is now a public company, and those are gig economy companies. Now, I personally don't think the gig economy is something to be held up as a great solution to unemployment.
To put it mildly.
So I think you'd be hard pressed to offer that up. Say, but it's real, and it's. I do believe the gig economy is going to be hundreds of millions of people eventually.
Well, it already is, isn't it?
I don't know if it's that many, but it's a lot. No, Silicon Valley generally, and I'm not going to criticize it because I agree with this. Silicon Valley generally embraces automation, and automation, generally speaking, reduces jobs. There's an article in the newsletter this week that says the pandemic is propelling a new wave of automation. I think that's far closer to the truth than the Valley is creating new jobs. And so then the question is, if automation and joblessness represents one definition of progress, which if you go back to the Enlightenment, it definitely does, then what is the societal solution to the workless? And the answer has to be within the realm of universal basic income. And there's another article here saying, is the solution to just print more money? And
that's modern monetary theory, right?
that article focuses in on modern monetary theory in the new book about what's it called? The deficit. I've forgotten the name of the book now, but I'll put it in as a caption when we publish this, which is basically saying that we have to, as a society, and she means globally, be prepared to give people money for free that they can spend on the things they need. And if you do that, they'll buy the things they need. And if they do that, the people who sell the things they need will get that money, and it will have value to them. And so everything will be good.
And is that viable, do you think? I mean, are you a modern monetary theorist? Do you believe in this idea that the deficit, it's called the deficit trap, the idea that the deficit is actually a delusion and that governments can just print money without any generally adverse consequences?
I do think the deficit is a delusion, but I'm not a great believer in... I think the problem with the book is it posits a solution within the context of capitalism. Now, within the context of capitalism, all of the things could happen, but the robots would be owned by individual owners. And so the wealth of society, and this, to really understand this, you have to distinguish between value and price. The owner can choose a price which is vastly greater than the value of a thing. The value of a thing should be aligned to zero because there's no human labor involved, but the price can still be held up. If that happens, you basically get inflation and all the money flows to the people who own the robots. So the truth is, once you get to a post-work society, it probably isn't capitalism.
And that's still very much in the future. Let's come back down to earth, come back to this week. What else is going on in venture? Hopefully no more stories about crypto this week.
There is. I always have a token crypto story at the end. But the biggest thing in venture this week for me is Y Combinator announcing that they're abandoning the batch-based accelerator programs where they typically have about 200 companies 2 or 3 times a year all together in the same time frame, and then they do a demo day and investors get to see them all. They're replacing that with something that I've been doing since 2010, which is, if you want to work with us, just ask, and if we like you, we'll start you right away on working with us, and we'll help you raise money at the time when you're ready at the end of that process. So no more batches, it's now a la carte, working with companies. So it's much closer to a seed fund style of picking companies and working with them.
But isn't that the old problem as what we started off with? I'm not saying Paul Graham discriminates for or against any group of people, but they're basically just investing in people they like.
Well, that's a tough critique because I think everybody does that. And they also don't invest in people they don't like. There's probably a bit in the middle where they sometimes invest in people they don't like. I've done that a couple of times and made money from them because they had all of the attributes of an entrepreneur, which is stubbornness, resistance to change, following through to the end no matter what. Entrepreneurs have to be like that because so many people tell them what they're doing is crazy. If they listen to them, they'd never do anything. So it's like you with Now TV. You know, I'm sure you're going to hear that it's crazy from lots of people. And if you're sensitive and listen, you'll never do it. So I think everyone invests in people they like. Then it comes down to who do you like. Like my particular thing is I like people who stand up to me. I like people who disagree with me. I don't even have to agree with them, but I prefer that they persuade me. And I usually don't want to invest in people who ask me what to do, because although that gives me a lot of power, it means I'm going to run their business, not them. So, everyone's different, and I think it comes down to picking your investor as being somebody that you believe is going to give you all the input that you need to be successful.
Any updates on the virtual investment culture? Are people still investing over Zoom, or they really want to meet the people, look them in the eye, touch them? Although we're not supposed to touch these days, even in the post-coronavirus world, I think we won't be allowed to do much hugging.
Yeah. So the answer is yes. We've been moving towards what you could think of as standardized deal making, of which video is just an element now. Y Combinator years ago created this thing called a SAFE document, which stands for Simple Agreement for Future Equity. It's a standard investment agreement. It's now used in, more than 80% of seed fundings use it. Some VCs don't like it, but it streamlines everything. It creates common rules. And this week, Jason Ball, who has a blog called Tech Bytes, wrote an article called How to Meet VCs and Fundraise During the Lockdown. And The Information wrote a companion piece called Can You Invest Over Zoom? Venture Capitalists Are Split. And I think what it comes down to is venture capitalists resist anything which undermines their boutique credentials to be better than anyone else. They like to assume they're special. But with Zoom and with safe documents, more and more people are using the same instruments, and therefore your distinguishing features get reduced. And eventually, I think where it leads is what Carter are doing with Carter X, which is they're building a stock market for private companies to raise money without pitching individual investors.
It's nice that venture capitalists are getting eaten by the very forces that they're creating. I wonder if there's any connection with dating. I saw there was a piece this week suggesting people are doing more and more online dating. I mean, they don't have any other choice these days. So the fact that VCs are being eaten by the very forces of automation and disintermediation, I think is quite healthy, amusing, at least from my point of view. Yes. Keith, big reads, anything that's really caught your attention this week? Anything that stands out?
There's one thing you told me about, and there's one thing I put in myself, which I would talk about. The one you told me about was John Gray's article in a new magazine called Noema, called Surveillance Capitalism versus the Surveillance State. It's a long read. It's really good.
It's not that long. And what I like about it, I'm wearing your hat now, I'm interviewing myself, is that we always assume that the West and China are operating off different models, and the West is democratic and the Chinese are authoritarian. What Gray argues is that they're very similar, and I think we're going to see more and more of these arguments, actually.
Yeah, I've been visiting China a lot from as far back as 1997, and even then my observation was there is a capitalist society with a single-party government, and the difference between that and the US, where we're a capitalist system with two parties that don't disagree on very much, is wafer thin. Obviously, there are massive consequences for things like civil liberties and individual rights. So I don't want to paper over that. That is significantly different. Go to the UK, you even begin to doubt that. In the UK, there is a surveillance camera on every lamppost, and anything anyone does is recorded. And you do begin to wonder in a country that hasn't had a change of government for decades, a couple of decades, and where civil liberties are constrained, let's say, you wonder if there really is a difference. So I think it's a very provocative read. It's worth reading.
And Gray is one of the most prescient and original, I think, social and political thinkers. Any other big reads that caught your attention? You said there was one other.
There's one other. Before I do that, I will say that tech, by the way, this is a broadcast about tech, but tech really plays into that debate because everybody expects tech to fix things that governments break. And so the focus on tech to be a good actor, whilst at the same time being legal, creates many, many dilemmas.
And I actually think you're talking about the UK. I think one of the more interesting pieces of news, you didn't include it in your newsletter, you probably should have done, or maybe I missed it, was that Google and Apple now, the British government have acknowledged that the Google-Apple data surveillance on coronavirus is a better system than the one they have, so they're using it. I think what we're going to see is the government acknowledging that it just doesn't have the firepower, the sophistication of the tech platforms. And that's going to change the nature of the relationship in the long term between private corporations and government.
Yeah, well, that's a good segue to the other good article, which is the Harvard Business Review published an article called The False Dichotomy Between Globalism and Nationalism.
Oh, interesting. Who's that by?
The author escapes me just this second, just a minute, because I didn't put the author's name, I just put a link, but I can tell you, if you give me a second. Let's click on it, here we go.
Yeah.
The author is David Walderman. Oops, sorry. David Walderman and Mansour Javidan. I don't know either of them, but they're focused in on things like Brexit. Other examples of the rise of nationalism, and they're also looking at China, by the way, same as the other article. The reason I included it is I am a determined globalist. I believe that nation states should be thought of in the same way that people thought of city states after they'd been eclipsed by nation states back in the day. I do believe nation states are a relic of the 19th century, and the future somehow is going to involve cities and the with lots of local democracy and lots of global infrastructure.
Interesting. I'm not sure, and this is probably the subject of another conversation, but given how we started focusing on identity and ethnicity, I wonder how those two things go together. I can see a world of hyper-globalization somehow connected with hyper-identity. And I'm not sure what that will look like, whether it'll be a good or a bad thing. And finally, Keith, tweets of the week, anything that really is good? Anything that...
my favorite one, going back to the start, is Lolita Torb.
Yeah.
She says, white investors underestimated founders, and she has a mathematical formula. And she makes the point, investing in underestimated founders is not charity. And I really it resonates with me. I say the same thing about UBI. If you do UBI, it's not charity. It's common sense.
Underestimated meaning what? People who you don't think are as good as someone else, but they qualify because of their racial or gender identity?
Yeah, Lolita coins the term underestimated as a catch-all for all kinds of ethnic, sexual, and other identities which are somehow reduced in importance by the people that make decisions about who to invest in. So it's a catch-all phrase. So her tweet is all about, she points to an article saying, "Can venture capital solve its whiteness problem?" I just think it's a great tweet. And then
I think the best argument against investing in white people is Mark Zuckerberg, because he's very smart, but also profoundly blind, willfully blind, and profoundly irresponsible too. So I think you ought to develop the argument that we need to invest in people with some sort of accountability and responsibility towards society. And it seems people like Zuckerberg don't have that, but maybe that's a subject for another conversation as well.
I'm not sure that's a racial characteristic, because you could say Condoleezza Rice, who was part of the war in the Middle East.
Well, I'm allowed to say this, Keith, because I'm Jewish. Maybe it's just young Jewish boys.
Dan Scheinman, who is a Jewish boy as well, I suspect, but not young. Great tweet. I saw some interesting seed-stage startups. As an investor, I get greedy when a founder has thought through the sales model to align with their product. What he's really saying is he wants founders to tell a convincing story to investors. I did publish a video essay this week on how to tell your startup story to an investor. So I picked that because it shines a light on that need, and there'll be a link to that in the newsletter. And then
and finally, Keith, finally, speaking of Jews, I assume that my team, the Yid Army, will blow Manchester United away tomorrow. What's your feeling on that?
Well, 10 years ago I would have laughed, but in 2020 I have to be very cautious because the chances of Manchester United losing are much higher than they were 10 years ago. So I will say this, Andrew, if it turns out that you're right, I will shake your hand and kiss you on both cheeks and hope to beat you next time.
And you will acknowledge that Jews are superior to Christians?
Well, as a non-Christian, I'm totally relaxed about any religion claiming to be superior to another, as long as we all agree that atheists beat them all.
Touche.